Signore e signori, grazie a nome di tutta la nostra comunità per la vostra presenza qui dall'Accademia Britannica. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to you all to the British School at Rome, where we are devoted to promoting profoundly interdisciplinary, international, and richly diverse research conversations. Tonight, it is a pleasure, a privilege, and a joy for us to be hosting a very special conversation in which Luca Gallofaro will present Grzegorz Piatek as part of our brilliant architecture programme, which has been curated by Marina Engel. The programme is called Fragments, and in it we have been investigating how ideologies are shaped, memories evoked, and emotions stirred by buildings, their contents, and their ruins. In the first year of Fragments, we focused on the Middle East, and in its sophomore year, we are turning our heads mainly towards Poland and Bosnia-Herzegovina. We have already enjoyed a challenging conversation between preeminent architectural historian Joseph Rickwart and Polish artist Miroslav Bałka, looking in part at their own shared hometown of Otwock near Warsaw. Tonight's Christmas present from the British School at Rome to you is to bring together two extremely illustrious figures to look together at the hugely significant work of Grzegorz Piatek, who's examining the role of architecture, planning, and reconstruction in Warsaw at two extremely extraordinary moments of transition. 1945, the end of World War II, when 80% of the building stock of Warsaw lay in rubble, and again in 1989, the moment of transition from socialism to capitalism. Both these events and moments provide opportunities for cities to rethink the past as well as to re-engineer and create a future. There could be no one better placed to examine this than tonight's two contributors, Grzegorz and Luca. Grzegorz many talents stretch to architect, curator, and critic, as well as co-founding an independent and vibrant architecture foundation and publishing house in Warsaw, the Centrum Architektury. He may be known to many of you for the Polish Pavilion at the Venice Biennale 2008, which was such a roaring success that he was awarded the Golden Lion. And tonight's avenue of inquiry, Reconstructing Warsaw, I'm very pleased to say, is leading to More Fruit, a book that Grzegorz is working on the theme of the post-war reconstruction of Warsaw. And we're all eagerly preparing our bookshelves for this. To introduce Grzegorz and his work in more detail, we have a second top-caliber speaker, Luca Gallofaro. Luca is a force both as an architect and also an educator. He is currently associate professor at the University of Camerino, but many top-rate institutions are drawing on his expertise as visiting professor, not least the Bartlett School London, Confluence Lyon, and the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris. Like Grzegorz, Luca is extremely well decorated, not least as victor of the gold medal for Italian architecture in 2006, for nominee for the Yakov Chernikov Prize in 2011, and also a finalist to the Aga Khan Award in 2013. He's the author of many essays and several books, not least Artscapes of 2008, and his most recent monograph, An Atlas of Imagination, which published only last year. Luca's contribution to architecture derives not only from his publications and not only from his many notable architectural projects, not least Ian Plus and LGS MA, but also through his innovative use of a range of research tools, including two groundbreaking blogs, the Book List and the Image List, and of course the new physical space right here in Rome that will be known to all of you, Gallery Campo. We're also looking forward immensely this year to the new independent magazine Divisare that will come forward in 2017. And also next year, Luca is co-curating the Biennale of Architecture at Orléans. So it is to Luca's more capable hands that I pass the parola to take us into tonight's event, but not before thanking you all very much for being with us, and particularly our two stellar participants, Luca and Grzegorz. Thank you.
So thanks a lot to be here, and I just want to say some words because I prefer to talk or to make questions at the end of the presentation with Gregor. I just want to say what I like of his work. I don't like curators. Fortunately, Chorra is not here tonight because it's a good friend of mine, but I don't like the figure of curators. And in that sense, Gregor is not a curator, but what I really like, that is an architect, is an historian, and he uses exhibition to think. So and that one was, from my point of view, the beauty of and the success of the Hotel Polonia, the pavilion that is curated in Venice, because it was an exhibition that was work on this subject, because it studied this idea of the city and how the city can change. And it's very interesting to present Varsavia tonight in Roma, because Varsavia is a city that changed many times, and try to give a new form to this present and to this future, but to rebuild this future for this city on the fragments of the past, and presenting this in Roma, that is a city that never changed. Roma, it's completely never changed. It's a stratification over and over, the same kind of building, the same kind of attitude in front of the contemporary architecture. But what I really love in this pavilion, for example, was this idea of considering the building that they are just open, the contemporary building as a ruins in the future. So this idea of working with this imagination, with montage, was one of the interesting things of this pavilion, that presents a contemporary building in a completely different form, imagining this building abandoned or reused in the next future. So that means that thinking about the past of one city or thinking the present of the city itself, he have the ability to rethink the future itself. So it's a kind of reverse of history. He's an historian, but it's interesting how he looks at the future to understand the past of the city itself. So I believe that this idea of the fragments, it's perfect on his work, and I hope that we can open a dialogue after this presentation. Thank you very much to be here today.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. And thank you, gentlemen, for your flattering introductions. And thank you for having me here. I've never been introduced as a Christmas present before. So an important turning point for me. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey through 20th and 21st century Warsaw. I'm going to bomb you with names and places that you've never heard of before, so I hope to be as clear as possible. And I'm going to tell you about the way we deal with the past. We've been dealing with the past in Warsaw. Warsaw is a city that has changed its appearance dramatically, at least 3 times in the last 100 years. And I'm going to tell you about these 3 pivotal moments, and the way we use the remnants, the fragments of the past, to, let's say, rewrite the history and to edit the past and to create a different future, which is very often a highly politically charged problem. Let's go 100 years back in time to the early 20th century, to the moment when Poland regained independence in 1918. We're actually celebrating the centenary in 2 years' time. And it's important to realize that Poland did not exist as a state for over 100 years. And Warsaw, its, let's say, symbolic capital, was not an actual capital. There was no state, so there was no capital. Nevertheless, Warsaw remained as a very powerful cultural center for Polish intellectual life and for Polish independent institutions, and also for any independence movements. But it did not, in the eyes of many Poles, it did not look Polish. It did not appear to be a Polish city. At the moment of when we regained independence. These are statistics that show you the, let's say, the demographics of Warsaw in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the this tiny portion, the 4%, is the Russian population. Warsaw was a part of the Russian Empire, and we had quite a big contingent of Russian civil servants, of the Russian army, etc. But it was still a very relatively small portion of the population. The majority was Roman Catholic, which usually equaled Polish. That's the 55%, and over 30% were Jewish. And the Russian population was just a little above 4%. Nevertheless, the city seemed Russian. Many Polish intellectuals, Polish writers complained that it doesn't look like a Western city. That's the reason why it did not have why they found that it does not have a Polish appearance was the power of the Russian institutions, the church. Many Orthodox churches were built in prominent locations around Warsaw, slightly too big for the number of believers. The educational institutions, and also Warsaw was a very unplanned city. It did not have a master plan until 1916. So it developed very chaotically, very organically, which, according to many Polish thinkers, including planners and architects, gave it an Eastern appearance, of a chaotic Eastern appearance. So one of the first goals of the city fathers and the planners after the First World War, after we regained independence, was to give the city a more Polish, a more Western appearance. That's the view of the city from the center, the old town, and the part of the center from the other riverbank. You can see one of the buildings that I'm going to draw your focus to in the moment, the Russian Orthodox Cathedral. Here's I'm going to tell you about the moment when Warsaw started to rediscover its pre-Russian past. In 1922, there was an exhibition organized in Warsaw of paintings of a certain Bernardo Bellotto, who was a Venetian painter born in Venice, trained by Canaletto, who was his uncle. Bernardo Bellotto is also very often referred to as Canaletto in literature, but in fact he's not the actual Canaletto. Canaletto lived in Warsaw in late 18th century, working for the last Polish king, and he left a set of pictures of the city, around 30, if I remember precisely, of them, picturing different public spaces, important public buildings, including the royal castle and the residences of the aristocracy, the churches, and also a very famous view of the city from the right bank. So a predecessor of this postcard. In 1922, these works were for the first time exhibited in public, and at about the same moment, Polish art history started to rediscover Polish architecture and art from the late 18th and the early 19th century, the classical revival, the late Baroque. And these pictures of Bellotto, they became template for a new vision of Old Warsaw. Bellotto was not completely faithful in his rendering of the cityscape, and art historians knew it well, that he would not be, he was not always very precise. And also he, as a Venetian, he would make the proportions he would make the buildings appear more slender than they actually were. But nevertheless, these pictures were taken as almost a photographic, faithful rendering of the cityscape of the pre-Russian independent Warsaw. And the goal was to get as close to that instead of this. The building that I already mentioned, the Russian Orthodox Cathedral at Saski Square, was the biggest problem for the new Polish government. It was one of the tallest structures in the city. It's just slightly lower than the tallest Catholic church. But still at around 80 meters, it made a very powerful presence in the cityscape. It was let's say, the last cry of the Russian Empire in Warsaw. It was finished in 1912, so right 3 years before the Russian administration left. But it managed to make a very powerful impact on the cityscape. It's actually, I think it can be compared to the Vittoriano. It's the same, let's say, proportion. And it was conceived as a symbol of Russian dominance, and something had to be done with it in order to restore the desired Polish appearance. You can see the church here compared to the rest of the city. As you can see, it's much higher than anything else in the neighborhood, and it was also very well visible from the river front, which I already showed you. For a moment, it was considered that it should be remodeled and used as a Catholic church. And it's a proposal from 1920 by one of the most prominent architects and one of the fathers of the Polish national style, referring to historic Polish architecture, Stefan Schiller. And there is a very telling caption below this picture. It's from a newspaper. That it's possible to convert the Byzantine edifice into a temple of Western European lines. But it did not happen. At the end of the day, it was decided that the church should be removed completely. And at a great expense and with great effort, it was dismantled. It was not possible to blow it up because it was too close to other buildings. So it was taken down brick by brick by brick by brick. By 26, it was gone. So it took a few years to dismantle, and the remnants, the fragments of the building, found their way around the city and around the country, which is a very interesting story that hasn't been properly fully studied yet. So the things that I'm going to mention now are I gathered from different publications. So some of the rubble, most of the rubble was stored away by the city of Warsaw and used for engineering in the next years. For instance, the boulevard, the waterfront, was built with the rubble from the partly with the rubble from the Orthodox cathedral. Then some of the mosaic decorations found their way around public buildings and churches. This is the architecture. This you can find at the staircase at the architecture school, my alma mater. And this you can find in one of the Roman Catholic churches. One of some of the stone was reused 10 years later in Krakow at the royal castle, at the cathedral, as an part of the canopy above the entrance to the crypt, where Józef Piłsudski, the founding father, let's say, of the independent nation, was buried in 1935. And it's a very symbolic structure. You may remember that from the Polish pavilion in Venice at the Architecture Biennale 2 years ago. A copy of that canopy was exhibited. And the original was made out of fragments gathered from different parts of Poland. And the stone comes from the Orthodox Cathedral in Warsaw. These fragments of the Orthodox Church were still in storage after the war. Not everything was, some of it was still in storage after the Second World War. So some of the stone and the mosaics made their way to this suburban church in the 70s. And some of them were put in the present-day Orthodox cathedral. All these mosaics are from the old cathedral in the 80s. So these fragments of the Orthodox cathedral keep traveling around the country and around the city. There were more public buildings, Russian public buildings that presented the same problem, but a slightly slightly smaller in scale. Take the Warsaw Scientific Society building from the 1820s, also designed by an Italian, Antonio Corazzi, which was remodeled as a Russian school in the 1890s in this Byzantine style, with also an Orthodox church, Orthodox chapel inside. And it had to be reclassicized, let's say, in the 1920s. And it's also very. I'll mention more of these examples. That the building, the new version, was supposed to be referring the old one, but was not entirely faithful. So you can see the size of the dome. So the architects would always take a chance to correct the original. The Old Town was also a source of a subject of a debate. It was actually a very poor area in the 1920s, and very neglected. And a huge effort was put into restoring some of the medieval and Renaissance townhouses into their original form, and also to change the social, let's say, to gentrify essentially this neighborhood. There were houses built for civil servants, artists, etc., to change the social reality of this neighborhood. But one of the landmark projects, one of the showcase projects in the Old Town was restoring the medieval city walls that were completely not visible. They were covered with newer buildings from the 18th and the 19th century. So the city bought some of the property some of the houses that had been built on top of the city walls in order to reveal them from. So the old newer buildings were dismantled. Were demolished to make these medieval city walls and this bridge visible. I'm going to explain the ideology behind it in a moment. It was also a very political act. The Second World War was coming, and everybody knew that a war will come sooner or later. So revealing a monument of military architecture was supposed to be have an educational and a political weight in the preparation to the war with Germany. So this is what was created, basically, because some of it was revealed, but the rest had to be built from scratch as the medieval city walls. Some other public buildings from some public buildings from the 18th century were also restored to remove any alterations made in the Russian period. Like the city hall was restored to its pre-Russian form. Same with the Blank Palace, a residence right next to the city hall, which used to be covered up with advertising and in very poor condition. It was restored to its 18th century supposedly original shape. The mayor, the last pre-war mayor of Warsaw, was very keen on all these operations, and he saw a big opportunity in bringing out the fragments of history of the city. He was talking, these words are from 1938, but he kept repeating that for years, that removing the ugliness, revealing the beauty, restoring Warsaw to its real beautiful and distinguished character is necessary. And that the number of monuments in Warsaw will keep on growing, the number of historic monuments. So even before the Second World War, even before the big destruction, there was this big appetite for creating more heritage, let's say. What was not possible before the Second World War became possible after the war. The war was seen by many architects and planners and heritage specialists as a blessing in disguise, a chance to bring out more history. So, as it was already mentioned, 70 to 80% of the buildings in the city were destroyed in the Second World War. Of course, it depends how you defined a demolished building. So the highest estimate was 84%, but it was slightly exaggerated. So it's safe to put it somewhere between 70 and 80%. And the center was the center and the old town were actually the neighborhoods that were suffered the most. Also, the population shrank from 1,300,000. That's the figure for August 39. To 162,000 in January 45, which shows you how big what a huge disruption the war brought in the life of the city and in the continuity of its growth. And it's also important to know that it's not just that there's more behind these figures. The entire Jewish population that formed over 30% of the population of the city before the war was exterminated. Within these 160,000, these 162,000 that lived in Warsaw at the end of the war, not all of them were original residents. There was a huge wave of immigration outside of the city during the war, and also some of the original population was replaced with refugees from other parts of the country. So the buildings, most of the buildings were gone. Most of the original residents were gone. Some of them came back after 45, but still a new city had to be created for a new population, a population that had no sentimental link to the buildings and to the pre-war city. Some of the people responsible for the reconstruction were actually involved in the process of heritage preservation before the war. Jan Zachwatowicz, you can see him here. I've already showed you this picture. This is the picture from the opening of the city walls, of the reconstructed city walls in 1938. Jan Zachwatowicz, who became the key figure for the post-war reconstruction of Warsaw and other Polish cities, was the leader of this project before the war. So the same set of people basically was responsible for the reconstruction of the country after the war. And Jan Zachwatowicz famously said that the nation and its monuments are one. And the communist regime, you could expect that the communist regime that replaced the pre-war government after 45 would want to create a brave new world, an entirely new city, an entirely new structure. But the communist government knew that they need the monuments back, they need the heritage back in order to legitimize the new government. That even though the policies and the ideology was completely new and quite revolutionary, it needed the old, let's say, the old setup, the old decor, in order to present itself as a legitimate Polish government. Actually, the post-war communist president Bolesław Bierut was a huge fan of architecture. He worked, he was an activist a housing activist before the war, lobbying for better housing for the working class. And he also sent his daughter to an architecture school. So the first communist president was a big fan of architecture and monuments, and he was actually, it's not a popular thing to say right now, but he's actually the last Polish president to take such an active interest in architecture and the shape of the capital city. He was famous for visiting the architect studios and discussing with architects. Well, like all dictators love that, but he was the last Polish president who would do that, who would take personal interest in the shape of the capital. But so the result of I'm going to talk about some buildings in more detail, but it's important to realize that when you walk into the old town in Warsaw right now, this is the Castle Square, the old town is entirely new. It's not, and it doesn't look the same as it did in 1939. So, as in the case of the Warsaw Scientific Society that I showed you, the pre-war renovation, architects would take the opportunity to correct the old buildings and to give them a more preferable shape. Sometimes they would go back to the original documentation or paintings, but sometimes they would take their liberty to redesign the buildings. For instance, the cathedral that was completed in 1956 is a scientific fantasy of Jan Zachwatowicz, the reconstruction guy that I mentioned before, who only had one drawing, and basing on this drawing, restored the cathedral to its supposed original Gothic 14th century form. The castle, the royal castle, was not rebuilt until the 80s, and it also looks different than before the war. And the goal was to give the city back, to give back to the city its old appearance. Not its original appearance, but its old appearance, in an idealized form, in an idealized way. The reconstruction and the destruction of the city also presented an opportunity to upgrade the historic quarters from the functional point of view. Demolition was one factor that facilitated the redesign of the center of Warsaw, but also the expropriation of the pre-war owners was an important factor. In 1945, right after the government decided to rebuild Warsaw, which was not such an obvious choice, it was discussed for a moment to give up on Warsaw and and to move the seat of the government to some other city. So right after this decision was taken, in one single act, the whole real estate in the city was nationalized in order to facilitate the reconstruction, but also to redress the balance of power in the city, to strip the bourgeoisie of their property, and to put the public interest, as it was understood at the moment, to the fore, and to give the working class access to some amenities and spaces that were not accessible to the working class in the capitalist city. So, what I'm presenting here are actually models from a pre-war exhibition about the future of Warsaw from 1936, showing the unhealthy conditions of the old tenement houses. You can see a very small courtyard and the air that is not that is stuck in the courtyard. And then you have the example of the correct, the healthy planning with much less density and with a green courtyard where the fresh air can flow freely. What was just a very optimistic vision before the war could become reality after the war, in this new situation of a demolished city and nationalized property. Also, from the same exhibition from 1936, come these two panels showing the wrong way to shape the city, the streets, with buildings of varying height, in a city that developed organically, where every plot has a different owner, and the planners have little influence on what is being built. And what the architects the planners before the war were dreaming of was to give the streets a uniform scale. Back in 1936, it was impossible. It was just wishful thinking. But with the demolition and the expropriation, the nationalization of the whole property, it suddenly became possible to rebuild entire streets in this regulated manner. And this was the case with the street Nowy Świat, one of the main historic streets of Warsaw, a part of the royal route linking the old town with the royal residences. This is a picture from the late Russian period, but it looked pretty much the same throughout the interwar period. These are the ruins in 1940, and this is what was created on top of the ruins. Some houses are copies of the pre-war houses, but some are modern buildings that have a uniform scale and also match, let's say, with the old ones. Also, the medieval city walls could be rebuilt again. The irony is that when the city walls, the medieval old town walls, were revealed in 1938, the war came a year later, and most of the structure that was revealed and rebuilt before the war was demolished. But the demolition of the city and the nationalization of the real estate presented an opportunity to rebuild the walls on an even bigger scale. So an artificial ruin was created around the old town, and it's still you can still see it. Also, the Barbican, the medieval Barbican that did not exist before the Second World War, could be rebuilt. This is a picture from 1938. So this is a part of the medieval walls that was revealed and reconstructed. But on top of this Gothic bridge, you would have private houses that could not be removed. After Hitler took care of it, took care of removing the houses, and the communist government took care of taking away the property from the original owners. So the Barbican that had been gone for centuries could be reconstructed in its supposed original form. So it can be looked at as an example of unconscious disneyfication of the old town. Another interesting case is you've already seen this, the Warsaw Scientific Society building demolished during the Second World War and rebuilt. This is its rebuilt form. And then a fragment of another building designed by Corazzi, the Italian architect who designed this originally, was put here in the courtyard of this building. So a fragment of this house that was not rebuilt was rebuilt, but at a different location in the courtyard of this building, based on very accurate surveys of the original. Bellotto, the so-called Canaletto, became useful again in restoring the monuments of Warsaw's past to their original shape. This is the Ostrovsky Palace, which now houses the Chopin Museum. This is what it looked like in the interwar period. It was a Baroque palace that underwent a series of very unsuccessful, quite heavy-handed alterations. And it was almost completely destroyed in 1944. And thanks to Bellotto and his supposedly accurate pictures of 18th century Warsaw, it could be rebuilt in its supposed original form, and as a let's say a national shrine to Chopin, our great romantic composer. But also the fragments of the pre-war city presented a very difficult practical problem. We're talking about millions of cubic meters of rubble. And the former Jewish district, the so-called northern district of the center of Warsaw, which was turned into the ghetto in 1940 by the German administration, was among the most damaged areas. Actually, it was flat. It was almost completely demolished after the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. The German troops would destroy the houses one by one by one. Only a few buildings were left, like these 19th century barracks or one church that was used to store the property robbed from the Jewish population. But otherwise, the whole neighborhood was just flattened. And 3 to 4 million cubic meters of rubble were left on the site. So that was this tabula rasa was a very tempting situation for planners, of course, and some Polish planners were already planning the new neighborhood before the war was over. And it was decided very early on that this neighborhood will not go back to its original form. First of all, the whole original population was perished, so there was no emotional link for most of the community to the neighborhood. And secondly, this neighborhood was among the ones with the worst living conditions before the war. And planners were actually dreaming of replacing it in the 1930s with something more healthy, more functional. So a new housing estate was built on the site, and Bogdan Lachert, an avant-garde pre-war architect, came up with this solution to use the rubble to the fragments of the old Jewish neighborhood to physically build the new neighborhood. There were several practical reasons for that. First of all, it reduced the necessity to take away the rubble and put it somewhere. Secondly, labor was extremely cheap after the Second World War because people were had no work, and production was extremely expensive, and even production of bricks was extremely expensive and difficult because the industry was destroyed. So it made perfect sense to reuse as much original material as possible on the site. Some of the original brick was reused as brick, and the rest of the rubble would be mixed with concrete and on the site and used to produce new blocks. They were called gruzobeton, which means rubble concrete. So the whole neighborhood was built out of rubble concrete blocks, and Lachert's original idea was to leave the facades of the housing of the blocks unfinished, untreated, to reveal the truth about the history of this, the troubled history of this neighborhood and its destruction. At the end of the day, it was decided that the working class cannot live in memorials, because these blocks would essentially be memorials to be lived in. And also the Stalinist architectural doctrine came with its love for ornamentation, and Lachert was ordered to redesign the blocks and make them to put ornament on top of this raw facades. So what you get now are smooth facades with some very optimistic floral ornamentation. But underneath, there's a very radical idea of reusing the fragments of the destroyed city to create a new future for it and to create the housing that was so badly needed after the war. And there are very few places where you can actually see some of the building material. There's this bookshop that recently opened in the neighborhood, and the owners made it a point to reveal the original material, and you can see it when you go there, but otherwise you can't. A lot of rubble was also reused to build one of the most important public projects in the post-war city, the so-called Decennial Stadium that commemorated the 10th anniversary of liberation. A very interesting ground scraper, that's a term that has only 20 years, that's newer than this building, but it is a ground scraper. It's a building that is made out of rubble and earth, and it's actually sunk into the ground. The surface of the football pitch is below ground level in order to blend itself smoothly with the landscape. And that's the way it was built. It was built with rubble brought from around the city, and then the seating was put on top of this rubble and earth. Jumping to 1989, and another important turning point in the history of our city. If I were to sum up this period of the last 27 years in the history of our city, it would be a period of intensive globalization, and overall, I think the overarching ambition of Polish architecture of the last 26 years was to create spaces that would look as global as possible. And it's also, I realize it's a global trend for cities to look increasingly similar all over the world. But there was this complex underlying this desire in Poland, in Warsaw, the complex of always lagging behind the West, lagging behind the recent fashions, not having the technology that the Western architects would have. So it's no wonder that after '89, the ambition was to create an image of Warsaw as a city that could be, with a skyline that could be anywhere else in the world, or maybe in the Northern Hemisphere. Here you have the Palace of Culture and Science, the tallest building in Warsaw, built in the 50s. But it's a difference. It's a story for another talk. The Stalinist skyscraper, and these new towers that keep going up, that look very global, are a way to overcome the trauma of communism. And they're universally seen as a cure for this, the powerful presence of the Palace of Culture, built with Russian know-how and some of Russian money in the 1950s, and very often likened to the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Cathedral that I showed you at the beginning of my presentation. There was also an idea to pull it down, but it was never treated seriously. So Warsaw is becoming increasingly global in its outlook, not just in architecture, also in design, the way the streets look, the restaurants look, the clothes. And the last, let's say, fragments of the original pre-war city, I don't mean the reconstructed bits, but the fragments of the pre-war city and that are the testament to the demolition, to the destruction, are disappearing. For instance, the stadium that I've already showed you was replaced with this, the National Stadium, on top of this ground-scraping 50s stadium, taking away the whole, overwhelming the original structure and the original idea behind it. And you can see less and less of the signs of the destruction. Some buildings, well, on the one hand, the city is more and more global in its outlook, but then a very bizarre wave of nostalgia for the pre-war city that started to surge in the 90s. It manifested itself through some very late reconstructions. For instance, the City Hall that was demolished in 1944, and then whatever was left out of it was removed by 1952 because everyone considered this building tasteless in the 50s. It's a 19th century Renaissance, French Renaissance revival, let's say, building that was considered tasteless in the 50s by the modernists. So in 1997, it suddenly comes back as the headquarters of the Polish branch of Citibank, and also a complete let's say, a false reconstruction. If you notice the line of white blinds on the piano nobile, it's not a coincidence. There's a floor there's an actual floor behind these windows. So the floors behind the reconstructed facade are much lower to accommodate more office space. So just the facade was rebuilt. And 20 years on, almost 20 years on, this building still feels alien and artificial. It doesn't have the patina of the old town, of the reconstructed old town. And another debate surrounds the former Saxon Palace. This is where the Orthodox Cathedral used to stand. This is the square left after its destruction in 1926. And the Saxon Palace was quite an important place symbolically in pre-war Warsaw, as it housed the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, a memorial to Polish soldiers fallen in the First World War and the fight for independence. So a very modest equivalent of your Vittoriano. So the tomb is down here, put in the arcades of a much older palace. This is what was left of the palace after the Second World War. The German troops, when they were withdrawing from Warsaw in late 1944, systematically destroyed the whole building, but they left the three arches with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Apparently some sign of respect from the German soldiers towards the Polish veterans. I'm not joking. That's exactly that could be the reason why the explosives were planted all over the building, except for this central part. After the Second World War, it was decided that the palace will not be rebuilt. and that a connection will be made between the square and the park behind the palace. Also, the architecture of this palace was not very highly rated, neither in the 30s nor after the Second World War. So the planners took a conscious decision not to rebuild the palace and instead leave just the three arches with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier as an even more powerful monument. So this is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier from the First World War, but also a monument to the destruction of to the struggle of the Second World War. But a number of people have been campaigning for 20 years now to rebuild the palace and also the Brill Palace in the back, and to go back to the supposed pre-war form, which is not possible because for many functional reasons, which I'm not going to, it's impossible to go back to the original form. And there's also no idea for the new function. There was an idea to put the city hall in it so that the city could pay for it, but the city hall will not fit into this palace, it's too small. There was an idea to have a hotel or something, a commercial development, but commercial developers are not interested because it would be a very difficult and expensive project. So this is a visualization from 2005 when the city government treated this idea seriously for the last time. And what happened when the project was under preparation and archaeological work started on the site, the original foundations of the palace were discovered, and the preservation officer said that they cannot be removed, which killed the project from the commercial point of view, because you cannot have the underground garage, which you would need for any office space or for a hotel. So the project was killed by the preservation officers in 2007, and it's now well shelved, I think, forever, even though there are some people still campaigning to reconstruct it for the 2018 centenary of independence, but it's already too late. But they counted that the reconstruction would cost 800 million zloty, which is roughly around 200 million euros. And this is a graph I prepared to show you in comparison to the expenditure on heritage protection. This is how much the city spends each year, and this is how much the Ministry of Culture spends each year. So you would have to provide 10 times more to build this artificial palace than the entire government spends on heritage protection, which for me is absurd. At the same time, Warsaw is also growing nostalgic for the remnants of the post-war city. I suppose it goes with generations that we tend to loathe what our fathers left, but then we get teary-eyed for what the grandfathers built or designed. So the generation of, my generation of the 30-somethings and the 20-somethings is growing nostalgic for the Warsaw we can't remember from our own experience. The Warsaw of the 50s, the 60s, of the late modernist period, the neon signs, the funky chairs, the scooters, and everything else, everything associated with the roaring 60s, with the swinging 60s. So neon signs, for instance, which were quite interesting in their design from the 50s and the 60s, keep disappearing from the streets, from the original sites. But then they find their way to restaurant interiors or to the Neon Museum, founded 10 years ago in a converted factory space. But at the same time, the actual remnants, the fragments of the 50s, 60s Warsaw keep disappearing from the cityscape under the pressure of the real estate market. I'm going to show you just two examples. The Central Department Store, an iconic building for Polish post-war architecture, built in 1952. So at the same time, the Stalinist Palace of Culture was going up in one corner of the center, and this was going up as a sign of international, let's say, the Western aesthetics. So this building, very much cherished by generations of Poles, of Varsovians, including myself, is now disappearing. This is the picture from 1 year ago, and the project is still at this stage. So it's let's say a protected ruin, and the owner, the developer, is promising to bring the original department store back by restoring the facade and all the original features, but it's not entirely true. It comes at an expense. The building has also another side with an office building and the whole rear part, which is equally important as the front. And the developer has already demolished this in order to gain more space and to build twice as much volume on the site of the original structure. So it's a restoration, but in a very twisted way. You will get the original facade back of the front part, but then this modernist sculpture, let's say, because it's a very complete form, let's say, is the original form will never go back. And the most recent story is the Emilia department store, a furniture store, built in the late 60s as this amazing, fully glazed space with a very expressive floating roof. It's just 2 stories high. It's actually seemed much bigger from the inside. It was so cleverly, the space was so cleverly designed. And of course a neon sign. And what happened a few years ago that the pavilion that was already not used as a store was taken over by the Museum of Modern Art as a temporary exhibition space. But at the same time, the furniture company that owned the store was bought by a developer who was only interested in this site, not the building. It's a very central site, right next to the central railway station and the Palace of Culture. And what is happening right now is that some architects are campaigning to remove the building from its original site, which is over here, and to reconstruct it at the foot of the Palace of Culture, the Stalin's Tower, in a park, as something. There's no idea. There's no fixed idea for the function. It could be exhibitions, a cafe. This building, which is now, as we speak, already being demolished physically, the demolition has already started, it's underway. So the idea is to store the original elements and to reuse them at the new site and use it for something. This is a scheme, showing the idea. So what would be original would be just the roof structure, the flooring, not the actual structure, the flooring, the terrazzo tiles, the stairs, and that's pretty much it. The actual bearing structure would be new, that's the pink, and also the facade, the glass facade, which of course the original one does not meet the modern standards. So this idea is highly controversial. I don't think it will come true because the developer who bought the building does not want to pay for it. They want the city to pay for it, or to at least share at least half of the cost. But this shows you that the modernist architecture of the post-war era is becoming a subject of the same kind of nostalgia that Warsaw has had for the pre-war architecture. So this idea to reconstruct the appearance of the old city in an idealized way, in an updated way, upgraded also from a technological point of view, is very much alive in Warsaw, and it's of course it has very little to do with the idea behind monument preservation. To preserve as much of the original substance as possible. It's more about the appearance. It's more about the fantasy of what the past was or could be, than about revealing the truth by protecting the substance. I mean, this building could have been saved. It was actually it was actually listed for a moment, but then it was removed from the monument register. So to close my talk, this is an idea that my friend, who's not even an architect or an art historian, came up with in a casual conversation, that in order to make everyone happy, we should have the Emilia Pavilion reconstructed on the site of the Ostrovsky Palace, since this is not going to happen anyway, and this still could happen. So why not put the pavilion? It's as absurd as putting it on the foot of the Palace of Culture, removing it from the original context, and to put it instead of the palace and give the square some more form and a new function. So this was an idea. This was a joke, but then I thought that it's quite telling. It's quite telling that there's not much difference between the craving for reconstructing the pre-war buildings that we don't even remember, that none of the living Varsavians remember clearly, and the heavily fashionable, heavily fetishized modernist architecture of the post-war periods. It's all about preferring image over substance, over the original substance. It's all about preferring the fantasy of the past over the sometimes difficult reality. It's about glamorizing the past, and it's about preferring the poetic view of history over the critical view of history. Thank you. So what's the order right now?
I think that best is that you stay.
Should I stay up here? Okay. Let me get myself some water.
Yes, of course. So I'm very curious about the book that you're writing at the moment.
Yes.
Of course, I think that this is not a traditional historical book. I look at it most as a mental map of the modern city, because what you are describing, I recognize fragment or action that happen in different cities in Europe in this moment. No, this idea of consumption and this idea of rethinking, or if you. They reflect the contemporary condition of the European city, but at the same time, you will recognize a lot of things that happen very fast in China, for example. Mm-hmm. No? In this idea of the consumption of the tradition, and especially in the last project that you present. So my question is about the book. You are writing a book about history, and for me it's not, or this map. Because I think that it's more related to a map that you are writing, no? In this moment, you are drawing a map of the contemporary city, and I think that this book could be a kind of manifesto of the contemporary condition of the city. So it's from my point of view, it's a very interesting thing that it's not a book about history of architecture. So which kind of direction you are getting with this book? Mm-hmm. What you want to have at the end?
Yeah. Well, what I want to have and what will come out of it is still, it could be a different, two different things. I'm writing a book right now about the reconstruction of Warsaw, about the first 5 years, actually, 45 to 50, roughly, the time when the Warsaw Office for Reconstruction existed, the most important institution that was responsible for redesigning the city. And of course, it will not be a purely historical book. I've always tried to look at history from the present point of view, and to try to learn something about the present. And I think one of the most interesting things about this reconstruction period right now is not just dealing with the remnants and dealing with the past, but also I'm going to write about an era when architects and planners had a much more higher, these professions had a much more higher profile. And it was a period, a very unique period in the history of the country and the city, when architects had the most power. They were very well, the whole, the expropriation of land, the fact that the whole land belonged to the state and to the city. It created a tabula rasa for architects that they could play with endlessly, cutting new streets, deciding what should be reconstructed, what not, what should be replaced with new buildings, reducing the density, providing greenery, providing new infrastructure. That was an enormous. That was a unique situation, and also they had the legal conditions to do that, but also a political backing. I already mentioned the president the first communist president of Poland, who was very keen on architecture and keen on grand gestures, and he was very keen on presenting himself as the patron of architects. So the key planners of that period and the key architects could always count on him to to back them up in their efforts to rebuild the city in a certain way. And I think it's very different from the situation right now, not just in Poland, but also globally, when architects feel I think architects feel very powerless and see themselves as a part of the system, like a cog in the machine that, it's not up to them to question the system.
And I have another question about the lecture of today. That it's the image that you use. No, they looks like don't come from the archive of the architects, of the archive of the city, but they are most fragments of the reality, of the day life reality. No, postcard, photo, and most of them, they are not image getting from the book, but they are looks like a collection of archival photo of this period. The point of view, it's not the best point of view to recognize the architecture. So, and at the same time, also the painting, no, of the Bellotti. If I don't, no, Bellotti is playing.
Bellotto, Bellotto.
And
not Canaletto, Bellotto.
And so, in that sense, I think that it's really very interesting, the origin of all this material, because it's not an historical. So working on a kind of daily archive of the life of the period. So you did a big research about that, and where you get all this?
I just keep digging. I think that is very healthy for an architecture historian to go beyond the technical drawings, the architects' papers, and the architectural magazines, the journals, which present a much let's say colder face of architecture. The official photos, the technical drawings, the official project descriptions, which are also very often very badly written. And it's important to look at the press pictures, the press clippings, the letters, the diaries. That gives you an insight into the way the buildings are used, the way they are perceived by the contemporaries, not just by the architecture critics like myself, and the professionals, but also by intellectuals interested in architecture, but also for ordinary people.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are some questions for the.
Could you tell us a little bit about the territorial aspects of this? Because you've been talking very much about the buildings themselves. And yet there's a much bigger picture.
Yes, but in which period?
Just sum it up nicely.
Yeah, okay, I'll try. I'll do my best. So as I already mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, Warsaw was a very unplanned city in the early 20th century. And 1916 is the time when, for the first time, Warsaw was got the first idea for a master plan. And it's a very typical thing for Warsaw, that the planning is not catching up with the building activity. It was the same in the pre-war period when planners there was a very good planning office at the city hall, and also a very interesting office for regional planning. That was the strength of the Warsaw City Hall before the war. Some of you might I know it was published in Italian like decades ago, the Plan Warszawa Funkcjonalna, the functional Warsaw, which was a plan for the whole city region. A very avant-garde idea back in 1934. The post-war period, the Reconstruction period, was actually the only moment in history when the planning had the chance to surpass the actual building activity, and many ideas from the 30s, from the pre-war period, could be realized, as I already mentioned. So some of the grand avenues cut through the city in the 50s and the 60s were already on the drawing boards in the 30s. Some of the parks, some of the squares. Also in the planning work actually did not stop during the war. There was the city hall kept on working, and the planners employed by the city administration kept on working, and they would on one hand deal with the day-to-day, let's say, planning activity, but also draw visions for a future post-war Warsaw. So it's quite important that the planning of post-war Warsaw started already in October 1939, so right after the takeover. The German troops take over Warsaw. So the architects and planners and the preservation officers were keen on, working on the post-war, the visions for the post-war city. And nowadays, planning is a very weak profession in Warsaw. We are back to this situation. We have good planners, but not enough. But the legal situation, let's say, prefers unplanning, let's say. So in '89, after the fall of communism, planning as an idea was rejected as a relic of the communist days, which is not true, because the roots of Polish town planning are in the 1920s and the early 20th century. But planning, in a communist country, the economy was planned, everything was planned. So the urban planning was also thrown away with the bathwater. And now we have a very chaotic situation in which it is impossible to have a master plan for the whole city. The Polish law does not allow to have one document, one plan that would cover the whole city. You can have local master plans, but a plan for the whole city is just a proposal. It's not a mandatory, let's say, set of mandatory rules. So Warsaw and other Polish cities developed quite chaotically. A lot of effort and a lot of money is being put into upgrading the public spaces, the squares, the historic districts, the streets, pedestrianization. But on the whole, the cities are quite chaotic. They're more of a collage of planned spaces, of smaller, planned on a smaller level, smaller scale than a whole. And the regional planning is non-existent.
Thank you very much indeed. I very much liked the last part of your talk with the idea of the nostalgia of various pasts or imagined past of the Polish history. And within this frame, I'd like to ask about my favorite building in Warsaw, which unfortunately did not feature in your talk, which is the Supreme Court. Now, I like it because I work on Roman constitutional law, and it has this like nice written, all the pieces of Roman legalists, Roman lawyers on the outside. So that is, of course, also kind of part of nostalgia. But I'm asking you, is the architecture of the building also part of a nostalgia of, I don't know, a certain period, a certain part, or is that, would that be a different example of kind of normal modern architecture, if there is a normal modern architecture?
It's a very peculiar, this building is very peculiar. It's not, it differs from the, let's say, regular building, let's say, contemporary architecture in Warsaw. It's a postmodern building. It was finished in 1999, so it's one of the last great postmodern buildings by our most prominent postmodern architects, Marek Budzyński. And as a postmodern building, it refers to historical styles. It refers to classicism and to some extent also to your fascist rationalist architecture. But I wouldn't see it as nostalgic. It's postmodern, so it's like an open book of references, but not necessarily nostalgic.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. I had the pleasure of visiting Warsaw about a dozen years ago and was fascinated by both the reconstructions of the old town, and I think at that time Norman Foster's building had just opened, so it was quite an interesting contrast.
Across the square.
Across there, yes. Yeah. It looked familiar. I have one question that arose. First of all, I was also, like the previous questioner, fascinated by your inclusion of a nostalgia for modernism under the same heading of sort of idealizing the past. Clearly, there's a nostalgia for the modern as well. I think that certainly in the United States, where I work, it's very, very clear. But I wanted to ask a question because, of course, it's understood in conservation that different buildings and different sites require different treatments. So not all historic buildings or sites need to be considered documents of the past. For example, buildings in a living city often cannot be treated as documents because they're constantly changing. So the question that occurs to me is it always image over substance in the sense of failing to be faithful to the ideas of conservation? Or is another way of looking at it simply that it's a matter of design, and it's a matter of people choosing what kind of city and how the city should be shaped in the future, and whether that involves including pieces of the past, whether as documents or something else, that perhaps we should be a little critical about our criticism also to understand why we're criticizing it that way. Maybe we shouldn't always impose the standard of pure conservation on every project that involves incorporating either a reconstruction or imitation.
Mm-hmm. The thing is, thanks, that was a very good question. The thing is that the post-war reconstruction in Warsaw and in Poland, it opened up, I agree that you cannot always be entirely faithful to the original substance, that you have to make difficult choices. But what happened after the war and what can be perfectly understood from the emotional and the symbolic point of view, this craving to have the old city back, even though not much of it was left, and to use the opportunity to update it, to make it look better than ever before. I perfectly understand it, but I think it's an exception that is understood, that can be understood when you think of a generation that still remembers the original. because it's like rebuilding your own home that somebody came and, tore down. I am very suspicious towards projects like this one, where it's pure fantasy. It doesn't relate to any one of us, and it's not even possible to fully assess whether this is faithful or not. In day-to-day activity of the monument preservation in Poland, this doctrine of preserving the authentic substance and bringing out the authentic substance is still the dominant one. But in case of landmarks and places that are important symbolically, like both of these buildings, the post-war reconstruction and the exception that the Polish architects made back then is still used as an excuse to propose things like that, or like the city hall that the Citibank rebuilt.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. And my question would be about the post-war reconstruction and the practicality of it. Is that true, and could you elaborate on that perhaps, that there was a lot of rubble brought to Warsaw also from the regained territories? So there was, talking about substance, there was a lot of alien substance being used in the reconstruction of the city, where there were obvious shortages of, for example, of marble, right, of precious materials, and that the regained territories, we're talking about former Prussia, about Silesia, for example, Wrocław. If I remember right, I think one of Polish writers, Maria Dąbrowska, wrote a memory about Wrocław 5, which are 5 years after the war looked worse than in 1945, because it was being basically spoliated of the precious materials which were being brought to Warsaw, which was a central point in the policy of reconstruction. Is that true, and could you elaborate on that? Was it a problem?
It is true. As I already said, the materials were scarce, and the industry that could provide the bricks and the other building materials was also suffered during the war. So it was not possible to produce enough building material to keep up with the pace of reconstruction. It is true that lots of building material was brought into Warsaw, but also to some other Polish cities that were prioritized for reconstruction, like Poznań and Gdańsk. These 3 cities were the first to be reconstructed. So material would be brought from other towns and cities into these cities that had the priority. It's not just marble, not just precious materials, but also ordinary bricks would be brought to Warsaw from Wrocław, from other ex-German, let's say, regained cities into Warsaw. The thing is that this problem has not been properly studied. It's something that I want to deal with. I'm sure I will not, it will be just a tiny part of my book, but I want to deal with this story. Because wherever you go in the former German territory, in every town you hear that the center of the city was taken down brick by brick to supply Warsaw with bricks.
Protestant churches, for example.
Protestant churches, but also regular townhouses. But I'm sure that if every city, every town that claims to be the victim of this of this process would really be the victim, Warsaw would be a much bigger city, entirely built out of German brick. So I'm planning to study that and to try to see the real extent of this phenomenon. No problem.
One last question, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for the talk. I see that you've written a biography about the mayor of Warsaw, Stefan Starzyński, but it says in the press release that he was notorious. I thought he was a heroic figure in the Second World War who was captured by the Gestapo and then after defending the city. Is it a mistranslation to call him notorious, or did he do some other things that you didn't approve of?
Yeah, he was a heroic figure in 1939. He was the highest ranked civil servant, stayed in besieged Warsaw and stayed with the people and made sure that the city functions more or less smoothly during the siege. And then he was captured by the Germans soon afterwards and shot down somewhere in Warsaw in December 1939. But before he became the hero, he was a politician, and he was one of many political figures of the pre-war Sanacja regime, of an authoritarian regime. So he would do many things that politicians do, like blackmailing people, to like doing different things that are on the in the gray zone between the good and bad, in order to achieve some goal. An extremely efficient, hardworking man who would sometimes cross the line in order to achieve his goals. So I'm presenting him not as of course I'm also covering the wartime story, but it was just the last 2 months of his life. Before, for the 41 years before, he was he was just one of us.
Well, clearly this is a fascinating discussion that we could take forward for a long time, but regretfully that's probably all we have time for this evening. So I would like to thank Grzegorz for bringing all of your skills to bear on this fascinating story with all its interlocking chapters of this extraordinary city. And so many of the questions that you're addressing, how ideologies reconcile the past and different generations, particularly this ebb and flow of nostalgias, are absolutely fundamental to architectural history and conservation and heritage management alike. And we applaud you for your work, and thank you very much for sharing it with us tonight. And thanks also to Luca for helping us through the discussion. And thanks to all of you. So please join me in thanking Grzegorz and Luca.